"Take your hands off my table, or I will have you removed from this establishment by force." Those were the words Eleanor Vance, head waitress and self-appointed queen of the Gilded Quill, hissed at an elderly gentleman in the restaurant's most coveted booth. She thought she was looking at a disoriented old man and his granddaughter, who had somehow wandered into a world far beyond their means. She thought her 30 years of service gave her absolute authority. But she made a fatal error. She hadn't bothered to learn their names because the young woman sitting opposite the man she was berating was holding a phone, her thumb hovering over a single contact, the one person who could demolish Eleanor's gilded cage with a single word. What happens when petty tyranny collides with quiet, unimaginable power? You are about to witness the fallout. This is the story of how one phone call transformed a head waitress's power trip into a spectacular public downfall. The late afternoon sun, the color of old honey, slanted through the tall, arched windows of the Gilded Quill, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny diamonds. For Clara May Thompson, a 22-year-old nursing student paying her way through school with endless shifts, this was the quiet hour, the lull between the bustling lunch service and the crushing dinner rush. She stood near the service station, polishing silverware with a linen cloth, her movements economical and practiced. To an observer, she was just another part of the restaurant's immaculate machinery. But behind Clara's placid expression, her mind was a whirlwind of anatomy charts and pharmacology notes. This job, with its punishing hours and often demanding clientele, was a means to an end. A starched white uniform, a degree on the wall, and a life spent healing, not serving. Her focus was broken by the sharp, metallic click of Eleanor Vance's heels on the marble floor. Eleanor was a fixture, as much a part of the Gilded Quill as the century-old mahogany bar. She was a woman preserved in vinegar, her blonde hair sculpted into a helmet-like coif that hadn't changed since the 1980s, her uniform so severely tailored it seemed to hold her perpetually upright. She moved through the dining room, not as an employee, but as a proprietor, her eyes scanning for imperfections, a crooked fork, a wilting flower, a guest who didn't meet her unspoken standards. "Clara," Eleanor said, her voice a low hum that carried an implicit command. "Table 7 needs to be reset. The Bradfords will be arriving at 6, and Mrs. Bradford detests seeing water spots on her wine glasses. Use the chamois, not the linen." "Yes, Eleanor," Clara replied, not looking up. She had learned early on that meeting Eleanor's gaze was an invitation for further critique. "And for heaven's sake, stand up straight. You look like a wilting daisy. This is the Gilded Quill, not some roadside diner. Our patrons pay for an atmosphere of excellence." Clara subtly straightened her spine, the familiar burn of resentment flaring in her chest. Eleanor's brand of management was a death by 1,000 cuts, tiny remarks designed to remind everyone of their place, which was always, invariably, beneath her. Clara had a particular talent that helped her cope. She was a gifted sketch artist. In the privacy of her locker, her break-time notebook was filled with wickedly accurate caricatures. There was Eleanor as a hawk-nosed queen, peering down her beak at the peasant staff. There was Mr. Abernathy, the hedge fund manager, who always complained about the temperature of his soup, drawn as a baby in a high chair. It was a small, silent rebellion, a way of observing and processing the world that kept her sane. This artist's eye for detail, for the subtle tells in a person's posture or the flicker of an emotion in their eyes, was a skill she hadn't yet realized was her greatest strength. At precisely 4:30 p.m., the heavy oak doors of the restaurant swung open, admitting an unlikely pair for the pre-dinner seating. An elderly African-American man, tall and dignified, even with a slight stoop to his shoulders, entered, his hand resting gently on the arm of a young woman in her late 20s. The man, Mr. Arthur Harrison, wore a simple but well-pressed tweed jacket and flannel trousers. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a deep, intelligent light. His granddaughter, Amelia, wore a simple black dress, her expression a mixture of love and protective concern. They didn't carry the flashy designer bags or wear the ostentatious watches that were common currency in this room. They carried only an air of quiet grace. Eleanor, stationed at the hostess stand, watched them approach. Her smile, a thin, painted-on slash of crimson, didn't waver, but her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Clara saw it from across the room. It was Eleanor's assessment look, the one that calculated a guest's worth in a single, sweeping glance. "Good afternoon," Eleanor said, her tone as crisp as a chilled salad fork. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes, we do," Amelia said, her voice warm and clear. "Harrison, for 2, at 4:30. Eleanor tapped at her computer screen, her perfectly manicured nail making a sharp, clicking sound. "I don't seem to have a Harrison. Are you sure you're at the right restaurant?" The implication was clear. "People like you don't eat here." "I am quite sure," Amelia replied, her own smile tightening. "I made the reservation myself, online. Perhaps you could check again." Clara watched, her hand stilling on the silverware. She knew that online reservations sometimes took a moment to sync with the main system. She also knew that Eleanor enjoyed these little moments of power, of making people feel small and out of place. After a deliberately slow search, Eleanor sighed. "Aha, yes, here you are, tucked away." She picked up 2 menus. "Right this way." She didn't lead them to one of the plush velvet booths by the window. Instead, she guided them toward a small, undesirable table near the bustling service station and the swinging doors to the kitchen. It was the table reserved for walk-ins, the one the staff called Siberia. "This won't do," Amelia said, stopping short. "The reservation was for a quiet booth. My grandfather is hard of hearing, and the noise from the kitchen will be too much for him." "I'm afraid all of our booths are reserved for our regular patrons," Eleanor said smoothly, a lie as polished as the floor. Clara knew for a fact that Booth 12, a prime corner spot, was open for another 2 hours. "Ma'am, the restaurant is nearly empty," Amelia pointed out, her politeness fraying. "Surely we could have that booth right there." She gestured to the empty booth 12. Eleanor's smile vanished. "That booth is held. Company policy. You can take this table or you can wait until your scheduled seating time, though I can't guarantee anything better will be available." Mr. Harrison, who had been silent, patted his granddaughter's arm. "It's all right, my dear," he said, his voice a soft, gravelly baritone. "We don't want to cause a fuss. This table is fine." Reluctantly, Amelia agreed. As they sat, Clara felt a pang of shame for her workplace. She was a nursing student. Her entire future was dedicated to advocating for people, especially the elderly and vulnerable. Watching this happen felt like a betrayal of her own principles. She was assigned their table. "Good afternoon," Clara said, approaching with a genuine smile, hoping to counteract Eleanor's chill. "My name is Clara, and I'll be taking care of you today. Can I start you with some water?" "That would be lovely, thank you, Clara," Mr. Harrison said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He had a kind face, one that reminded Clara of her own grandfather. As they settled in, Mr. Harrison placed a small, worn object on the table beside his plate. It was an old leather-bound book, no bigger than his hand, its cover softened and darkened with age. The leather was cracked, and the pages, visible from the side, were yellowed and delicate. He rested his hand on it, his thumb stroking the cover in a gesture of absent-minded affection. Clara brought their water, her nursing instincts kicking in. She noticed a slight tremor in Mr. Harrison's hands as he reached for his glass. Without being asked, she returned a moment later with a straw on a small silver tray. "I thought this might be a little easier, sir," she said quietly. Mr. Harrison looked up, surprised and then deeply touched. "Well, aren't you a thoughtful young woman?" "Thank you very much." Amelia's guarded expression softened. "That's very kind of you," she said to Clara, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. "You see him?" "Thank you." They ordered their meal, and for a while there was peace. They spoke in low tones, Mr. Harrison occasionally opening the little book and pointing to a page, a soft smile gracing his lips as he shared a memory with his granddaughter. Clara watched them from a distance, a small, warm spot blooming in her chest. This was what service was supposed to be about, facilitating a moment of connection and comfort for people. But Eleanor was a storm system that could not be avoided. She was circling the dining room, her eyes missing nothing. Her gaze fell upon table 14, and specifically upon the small, worn book. She stopped, her body stiffening. She changed course, her heels clicking like a metronome of doom, and marched directly to their table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through their quiet conversation. Mr. Harrison looked up, startled. "Yes?" "I'm going to have to ask you to remove that item from the table," Eleanor said, gesturing to the book with a flick of her wrist as if it were a piece of garbage. Amelia's jaw tightened. "I beg your pardon? It's just a book." "This is a fine dining establishment," Eleanor stated, her voice rising in volume, attracting the attention of the few other diners in the room. "We maintain a certain standard of decorum. Personal effects, especially ones that are weathered, are not to be kept on the table. It's unsanitary and it detracts from the ambiance." Mr. Harrison's hand instinctively covered the book, a protective gesture. "This book is very important to me," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "It was my wife's." "Be that as it may," Eleanor said, completely unmoved. "It cannot stay here. You can place it on the floor under your seat." "I will not put my wife's memory on the floor," Mr. Harrison said, a flash of steel in his old eyes. The book, Clara now understood, was not just an object. It was a reliquary. It held something sacred. The confrontation escalated quickly. Amelia stood up, placing herself between Eleanor and her grandfather. "This is outrageous. It's a small book. It is bothering no one. We are paying customers, and we are asking for you to leave us in peace." "You are in my dining room, and you will follow my rules," Eleanor snapped, her professional veneer cracking to reveal the raw arrogance beneath. "This is not a library. It is not a picnic. It is the Gilded Quill. And if you cannot respect our standards, then perhaps you would be more comfortable elsewhere." Clara, watching from the service station, felt her blood run cold. She saw Mr. Harrison's face, the deep hurt in his eyes. She saw the other guests turning to stare, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. This was no longer a simple seating dispute. This was a public humiliation. "Give me the book," Eleanor demanded, her hand outstretched. "I will hold it for you at the hostess stand until you are finished." "No," Mr. Harrison said, his voice firm. He tried to pull the book closer to him. And then Eleanor did the unthinkable. She reached across the table, her fingers snatching at the delicate leather. Her grip was too aggressive, her movement too sudden. The book slipped from both their grasps. It fell to the floor, not with a thud, but with a dry, heart-breaking rustle. It landed open, its spine cracked, and a flurry of small, dried flowers and brittle, yellowed pages scattered across the marble floor like fallen leaves. A collective gasp went through the room. Mr. Harrison cried out, a sound of pure anguish as he tried to bend down, his body too stiff with age. "Eleanor," he whispered, his wife's name, a plea to the ghost in the book. Amelia knelt, her hands shaking as she tried to gather the fragile pieces of her grandmother's life. "What have you done?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, a flicker of shock on her face, but it was quickly replaced by defensive fury. She had lost control, and she knew it. The only way out was to double down. "Look what you've made me do," she hissed at Mr. Harrison. "If you had simply complied, this wouldn't have happened. You are creating a disturbance." She pointed a trembling finger at him. "Take your hands off my table, or I will have you removed from this establishment by force. I will not tolerate this kind of behavior." Clara couldn't stay silent any longer. She moved forward. "Eleanor, stop. This has gone too far." Eleanor whirled on her. "You, get back to your station. One more word out of you and you are fired. Do you understand me?" Clara froze, the threat hanging in the air. Her tuition, her future, it all depended on this job. But then she looked at Mr. Harrison's devastated face, and the calculation changed. Some things were more important than a paycheck. But before she could speak, Amelia stood up. Her face was a mask of cold fury. The tears were gone, replaced by a terrifying calm. She didn't yell. She didn't scream. She simply took out her phone. "Put that away," Eleanor commanded. "There are no phone calls in the dining room." "I think you'll want me to make this one," Amelia said, her voice dangerously quiet. She unlocked the screen, her thumb finding the contact saved simply as Julian. She pressed the call button. Eleanor scoffed. "Who are you calling? Your lawyer? I assure you, this restaurant has the best legal team in the city." She crossed her arms, looking triumphant, believing she had weathered the storm and re-established her dominance. She thought she had won. Amelia put the phone to her ear. It rang once. "Amelia," a man's voice answered, deep and weary. "Is everything all right? I thought you were taking your grandfather out." "We're at the Gilded Quill," Amelia said, her eyes locked on Eleanor's. "And we have a problem. Your head waitress, a woman named Eleanor, has just thrown my grandmother's book of poems on the floor and is threatening to have my grandfather physically removed." There was a pause on the other end of the line. A heavy, charged silence that seemed to suck the air out of the room. "Give the phone to the manager," the voice said, no longer weary, but sharp as broken glass. Eleanor's smug expression faltered. She heard the authority in the voice, even muffled through the phone. She saw the shift in Amelia's demeanor from victim to executioner, but she couldn't connect the dots. "I am the manager in charge of this floor," Eleanor said haughtily, "and I don't speak to complaining relatives on the phone." "He's not my relative," Amelia said, holding the phone out. "He's your boss, Julian Croft, the owner." The name dropped into the silent dining room like a bomb. Julian Croft, the reclusive, almost mythical owner of the entire Croft Hospitality Group, a man no one at this level had ever spoken to, let alone seen. Eleanor's face, which had been flushed with anger, turned a ghostly, mottled white. The blood drained from it so fast she looked like she might collapse. Her carefully constructed world, her kingdom of polished silver and petty rules, was beginning to fracture. "Put it on speaker," Julian Croft's voice commanded, now loud enough for those nearby to hear. Amelia tapped the screen. The voice, now amplified, filled the space around the table. It was calm, controlled, and utterly terrifying. "Eleanor Vance, is that your name?" Eleanor couldn't speak. She could only nod, a jerky, puppet-like motion. I am waiting for an answer, Miss Vance. The voice boomed from the small device. Yes. Yes, sir. Mr. Croft, she stammered, her regal posture crumbling. Good, Julian Croft said. Now, explain to me, in detail, why Arthur Harrison, a man my late father considered one of his dearest friends, is currently on his hands and knees picking his dead wife's memories off your floor. The revelation hit the room like a second shockwave. Arthur Harrison wasn't just any customer. He was a friend of the founder. The foundation upon which this entire restaurant was built. Eleanor stared at the kind, elderly man she had just bullied and humiliated, and for the first time, she didn't see an inconvenience. She saw the ghost of her own career. The silence that followed was absolute. The clinking of distant cutlery stopped. The low murmur of conversation died. Every eye in the gilded quill was fixed on the drama unfolding at table 14. Eleanor Vance stood trapped in the spotlight, exposed and utterly alone. "Mr. Croft, sir, I was unaware," she stammered, her voice a reedy, pathetic version of its former authority. "There was a misunderstanding regarding our policy on personal items." "A misunderstanding?" Julian Croft's voice cut through her excuse like a surgeon's scalpel. "Amelia tells me you threw a book on the floor. Is that part of your policy?" "No, sir, of course not. It was an accident. The gentleman was being uncooperative. He was causing a scene." She was grasping at straws, trying to paint herself as the victim, the enforcer of order against unruly guests. It was a script she had used 100 times before. "A scene," Croft repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "Let me speak to someone else. Is there another employee nearby? A server, perhaps?" Amelia's eyes found Clara, who was standing frozen a few feet away, a silver tray still in her hand. Amelia gestured for her to come closer. "There's a waitress here, sir. Her name is Clara." "Put Clara on the phone," Croft commanded. Trembling, Clara stepped forward and took the phone from Amelia's outstretched hand. "Hey, hello?" "Clara," the voice said, and to her surprise, it was gentler now, though still firm. "My name is Julian Croft. I need you to be very honest with me. I'm not interested in blame. I'm interested in the truth. Tell me exactly what you saw from the moment Mr. Harrison and his granddaughter arrived." Clara took a deep breath. She looked at Eleanor, who was glaring at her with pure venom, a silent threat to stay quiet. Then she looked at Mr. Harrison, who was now seated, Amelia carefully placing the rescued pages back into the broken book on his lap. The sight of his grief-stricken face solidified her resolve. "Mr. Croft," Clara began, her voice gaining strength and clarity with each word. Her nursing training, the part that taught objective observation and reporting, took over. They arrived at 4:30 for their reservation. Eleanor initially claimed she couldn't find it. When she did, she seated them here, at table 14, next to the kitchen, despite their request for a quiet booth, and despite booth 12 being available. She continued, her memory for detail astonishingly precise. Mr. Harrison placed a small, leather-bound book on the table. It was not in the way of the service. I offered him a straw for his water because I noticed a slight tremor in his right hand. He was very gracious. They were speaking quietly. They were bothering no one. "And then?" Croft prompted. And then Eleanor approached. She told him the book was unsanitary and weathered, and that it had to be removed from the table. Mr. Harrison explained it belonged to his late wife. He refused to put it on the floor. Eleanor then attempted to take it from him by force. That's when it fell. Did Mr. Harrison raise his voice? Was he aggressive in any way? "No, sir," Clara said firmly. "He was distressed, but he was a perfect gentleman. The only aggression in the interaction came from Miss Vance. She was the one who was loud. She was the one who threatened to have him removed. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Julian Croft spoke again, all traces of gentleness were gone. His voice was arctic. "Thank you, Clara. That's all I needed to hear. Now, put Eleanor Vance back on the phone." Clara handed the phone back to Eleanor, whose hand was shaking so badly she almost dropped it. "Miss Vance," Croft said, the two words landing like hammer blows. "You are not to speak another word to the Harrison family. You are not to speak to the staff. You will go to the manager's office and you will wait there. The general manager, David Chen, is on his way to the restaurant now. I am 10 minutes behind him. We will conclude your employment this evening." "My employment?" Eleanor shrieked, the words tearing out of her. "You can't fire me over this. I have been here for 30 years. This restaurant is my life." "It was your life," Croft corrected her coldly. "You have taken the legacy of hospitality my father built and twisted it into your own petty fiefdom. You are a disgrace to his memory and to this establishment. Now do as I say. Go to the office and wait." The line went dead. Eleanor stood motionless, the silent phone still pressed to her ear. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving behind a pasty, slack-jawed mask of disbelief. The entire dining room had heard. The other guests, the busboys, the junior servers. Her humiliation was total and public. Slowly she lowered the phone. She looked at Mr. Harrison, not with remorse, but with a dawning, horrified understanding of the magnitude of her mistake. She turned and, without another word, walked away. Her stride was no longer the confident march of a queen. It was the shuffling, broken gait of the deposed. The moment she was gone, the tension in the room broke. One of the other diners, a man in an expensive suit who had watched the entire exchange, stood up and walked over to Mr. Harrison's table. "Sir," he said, his voice filled with respect, "I am so terribly sorry for what you just endured. That was unconscionable. If you need a witness for any reason, here is my card." Soon another couple came over to offer their sympathies. The atmosphere had transformed from one of awkward silence to one of communal support for the elderly man who had been so cruelly mistreated. Clara knelt beside Mr. Harrison. "Sir, are you all right? Can I get you anything?" He looked at her, his eyes swimming with unshed tears. He patted her hand. "You are a good girl," he whispered. "A very good girl. You stood up for an old man." 10 minutes later, as promised, 2 men in dark suits entered the restaurant. The first, David Chen, the general manager, had a panicked look on his face. The man behind him was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with greying hair, a tired face, and eyes that seemed to have seen far too much of the world. He wore a simple tweed jacket, not unlike Mr. Harrison's. This was Julian Croft. He didn't look like a billionaire. He looked like a history professor. He ignored everyone else and walked directly to table 14. He knelt, his expensive trousers creasing on the marble floor, so he was eye-level with the seated Mr. Harrison. "Arthur," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I am so sorry. My father would be turning in his grave if he knew you were ever treated with anything less than the utmost honor in this house." Mr. Harrison managed a weak smile. "Julian, look at you. You look just like him." He gestured to the scattered pages on the table. "Eleanor." She didn't know. "That's not an excuse," Julian said, his eyes hardening as he looked at the broken book. "Cruelty doesn't require a reason, Arthur. It only requires an opportunity." He stood up and turned to Clara. "You're Clara?" Yes, sir. You have more integrity and decency than someone with 30 years of seniority, he said simply. Don't go anywhere. I want to talk to you when I'm done here. He then turned to David Chen. David, please escort Mr. Harrison and his granddaughter to my private study upstairs. Open the 61 Lafitte. Get them anything they want from the kitchen. Their meal is, of course, on the house for life. And have someone from maintenance come down here with archival. The manager's office was an airless cube of beige walls and cheap wood veneer, a place where paperwork went to die. For 30 years, this room had been Eleanor Vance's inner sanctum, the silent, sterile heart of her kingdom. Now, it was her tribunal. She sat bolt upright in the stiff visitor's chair, her spine a rod of defiance, her hands clasped so tightly over her purse that her knuckles were bone white. She had spent the last 15 minutes not in panic, but in furious, methodical construction, building a fortress of justification around her actions. The man was uncooperative. The granddaughter was insolent. She was maintaining standards. The words were bricks, and she layered them carefully in her mind, creating a narrative where she was the beleaguered guardian of order, not the architect of this chaos. When the door opened, the sterile air in the room seemed to crackle and ionize. Julian Croft entered first, his presence filling the small space, not with physical bulk, but with an unnerving stillness. He was not what she'd expected. Decades of whispered staff room lore had painted him as a phantom, a name on a letterhead, a remote god of finance. But the man before her looked more like a weary academic, his tweed jacket rumpled, his face etched with a profound disappointment that felt infinitely more damning than rage. David Chen, the general manager, followed him in like a nervous shadow, closing the door with a soft, funereal click. Croft did not sit. He moved to the far side of the small room, placing his hands on the back of the manager's chair, her chair, and leaned on it, his gaze fixed on her. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. It was a deliberate weapon, and Eleanor felt her carefully constructed fortress begin to crumble under its weight. 30 years, Croft said finally, his voice a low baritone, devoid of heat but heavy with significance. 30 years, Miss Vance. My father hired you himself. He used to say you had the sharpest eye in the business, that you understood this place wasn't just about food. It was about creating a sanctuary for people, a place of grace. Here was her opening, the appeal to legacy. I have always honored his vision, Mr. Croft, she said, her voice tight but controlled. Tonight, I was trying to protect the very standards he established. The ambiance was being disrupted. Croft's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something cold and sharp appeared in his eyes. Tell me about your standards, Eleanor. Help me understand. Is there a specific rule in the employee handbook about the acceptable age and condition of a guest's personal literature? The question was a scalpel sliding past her defenses. Of course not, sir. But there is an unwritten rule of decorum, of presentation. The book was tattered. It lowered the tone of the table. The tone, Croft repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He pushed off the chair and began to pace the tiny room, his footsteps unnaturally loud in the silence. The Gilded Quill has served presidents, Nobel laureates, and movie stars. We've also served a mechanic celebrating his 20th anniversary with his wife and a young soldier on his last night of leave before deployment. My father believed that the tone of this restaurant was set not by the price of a guest's watch, but by our capacity to treat every single person who walks through that door with absolute, unequivocal dignity. You didn't see a man tonight, Eleanor. You saw a demographic you had prejudged as unworthy. You saw a worn-out book, and your standard was to deem it trash. He stopped directly in front of her, forcing her to crane her neck to look up at him. That book, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, is a first-edition collection of poems by Eleanor Rilke Harrison. She was a poet of some renown in her day, though she never sought the spotlight. More importantly, she was Arthur's wife for 52 years. He carries it with him everywhere he goes. He reads her words to feel her presence. You didn't just knock a book to the floor, Miss Vance. You trampled on a man's last, most precious connection to the love of his life, and you did it for the sake of ambiance. The name Eleanor Harrison meant nothing to her, but the weight of Croft's words was crushing. Her carefully constructed reality, where she was the righteous enforcer, was dissolving into a septic pool of petty cruelty. The bricks of her fortress were turning to sand. I couldn't have known, she stammered, the words tasting like failure. No, Croft agreed, a terrible sadness in his voice now. You couldn't have. Because to know, you would have had to ask. You would have had to look at that man and see a human being with a history, with a love and a loss as profound as any you could imagine. You would have had to be curious. You would have had to be kind. My father's greatest standard was kindness, Eleanor. It seems that after 30 years, it's the only one you never managed to learn. He straightened up, his brief moment of connection severed. The weary academic was gone, replaced by the CEO. David has your final paycheck and the necessary severance paperwork. It is the bare minimum stipulated by law. Your personal belongings will be gathered from your locker and couriered to you. A security guard will escort you out through the service exit. The finality of it was like a physical blow. The room tilted. 30 years. Not a career. It was her entire identity. The crisp uniform was her skin. The scent of beeswax and roasting duck was the air she breathed. The deference of the staff, the gratitude of the patrons she deemed worthy. That was her nourishment. Without it, what was she? Please, she whispered, the sound raw and alien in her own ears. The Queen was begging. Mr. Croft, it was one error in judgment. 30 years of perfect service. My life is here. No, Julian said, his voice now utterly devoid of emotion. Your job was here. Your life is something you must now build elsewhere. And this was not one error. David, he nodded to the pale-faced manager, pulled your file at my request. 7 formal complaints in the last decade. A family with a special needs child made to feel unwelcome. A young couple who didn't look the part, denied a table in a half-empty room. An elderly woman chastised for the volume of her hearing aid. It's a pattern, Eleanor. A long, ugly pattern of you using the prestige of my family's name as a cudgel to enforce your own pathetic prejudices. Tonight wasn't an anomaly. It was simply the night your cruelty picked a fight it couldn't win. You were not protecting a standard. You were guarding the gate to your own fragile ego. He turned to the door. David, see to it. I'm going to check on Mr. Harrison. He left. The door closed again, and the silence that rushed back in was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Eleanor Vance looked down at her hands. They were trembling. She had built her world on a foundation of power, but it was a borrowed power, a reflected glory from the restaurant's name. And in the space of a single phone call, the light had been switched off, leaving her in the dark with nothing. Upstairs, in the hushed, book-lined sanctuary of Julian Croft's private study, the world felt a universe away. The air smelled of old leather, cedar, and the ghost of cigar smoke from a bygone era. A bottle of 1961 Chateau Lafite Rothschild, opened with a reverence bordering on religious, breathed on a silver coaster. Arthur Harrison held a glass, the deep garnet liquid catching the light from the desk lamp. The tremor in his hand was gone, steadied by the warmth of the room and the profound, soul-deep relief of being seen, of being honored. Clara stood near the doorway, feeling like an intruder in a scene of immense intimacy. She was still wearing her server's uniform, a stark black and white reminder of a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else, an hour ago. Amelia had gently guided her here, insisting she stay. Now, Amelia sat on the arm of her grandfather's leather armchair, her hand resting on his shoulder, the fierce, protective tension finally gone from her face. On the large mahogany desk, the rescued pages and the broken spine of the book lay carefully arranged inside a clear, archival portfolio. It looked like evidence from an archaeological dig, precious and terribly fragile. Julian Croft entered the study, the hard lines of his face softening as he saw them. He closed the door, shutting out the rest of the world. "It's done," he said quietly, addressing Arthur. "She will not trouble you or anyone else in this establishment again. I am profoundly sorry, Arthur, for everything." "You have nothing to be sorry for, my boy," Arthur said, his voice raspy with emotion. He gestured with his glass toward the portfolio. "She is the one who should be sorry, not for offending a friend of your father, but for not knowing that a thing of beauty is a thing of beauty, no matter how worn the cover." Julian's gaze shifted to Clara, who instinctively straightened her shoulders. "Clara," he said, walking toward her, "tonight you were faced with a choice. You could have remained silent to protect your job, and no one would have blamed you. Instead, you spoke the truth to power. You chose decency over self-preservation. In my experience, that is the rarest and most valuable human currency." "She did more than that," Amelia interjected softly. "Before all of this, when we first sat down, she saw my grandfather. She didn't see an old man or a problem. She saw him. She brought him a straw without being asked. It was a small thing, but it was everything." Julian nodded, studying Clara with a new intensity. "The straw," he mused. "That's it, isn't it? That's the whole story. Observation, empathy, and action. That's the core of true service, the core of true care." He walked to his desk, took a pen and a large checkbook from a drawer. The sound of his pen scratching across the paper was the only sound in the room. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She watched as he tore the check from the book and walked back to her. "The Croft Family Foundation maintains an educational trust," he said, holding the check out to her. "It is for individuals who demonstrate the precise qualities we want to encourage in the world. Amelia told me you're a nursing student, working to pay your way through." "Yes, sir," she whispered. "Consider your tuition, books and living expenses covered until you graduate," he said. "The world has enough managers. It desperately needs more healers. I will not have your education compromised by a single day more of dealing with the Eleanor Vances of the world." Clara looked down at the slip of paper in her hand. The number written on it was staggering, an impossible figure that made the room swim. It wasn't just money. It was freedom. It was the end of exhaustion, the end of the constant, gnawing anxiety about rent and bills. It was the future, handed to her on a piece of paper. A wave of vertigo washed over her, and with it, a strange, unexpected pang of sorrow for the woman downstairs whose future had just been extinguished. "Sir, I can't," she stammered, trying to hand it back. This is too much. I only did what was right." "And I am rewarding what is right," he insisted, gently closing her fingers over the check. "Accept it, Clara. Accept it as an investment in a future where people are cared for with dignity." He paused, his expression turning thoughtful. "In fact, I want to extend that investment. My company is in the early stages of developing a new line of luxury assisted living communities. It's a passion project, a way to honor my father's final years. Our motto is dignity by design. But I've been struggling. The architects bring me blueprints, the finance people bring me spreadsheets, but no one can bring me the heart. No one is talking about the straws." He looked at her, his eyes alight with a sudden idea. "When you graduate, I want you to come work for me. Not as a nurse on the floor. I want you to help me build the entire philosophy of care from the ground up. I want you to take your artist's eye, your nurse's empathy, and teach our staff how to truly see our residents. We'll call it the Harrison Protocol, in honor of tonight. You won't just be a nurse, you'll be an architect of compassion." Tears, hot and overwhelming, welled in Clara's eyes. This was more than a check, more than a job. It was validation. It was the quiet, secret parts of herself, the observer, the artist, the caregiver, being seen, named, and given a purpose so vast she could barely comprehend it. Arthur Harrison beckoned her closer. She knelt by his chair, and he took her hand, the one not holding the check. His skin was thin and soft as old paper. "My Eleanor," he said, his gaze distant. "She used to say that the greatest art is to notice, to see the light on a dust mote, the weariness in a stranger's smile, the small tremor that asks for a kindness. You, my dear, are an artist. Never let anyone tell you otherwise." An hour later, Clara walked out of the grand oak doors of the Gilded Quill, flanked by Amelia and Arthur. The cool night air was a balm on her flushed cheeks. A black car, sent by Julian, purred at the curb to take the Harrisons home. As Amelia helped her grandfather into the car, Clara saw a figure emerge from the service alley down the street. It was Eleanor Vance. She was no longer wearing her severe, immaculate uniform. In its place was a simple, slightly worn coat. Her blonde coif, which had always seemed like a helmet, was now just hair, and it looked strangely deflated. She held a small cardboard box containing the contents of her locker. She did not look toward the front of the restaurant. She simply turned in the opposite direction and began walking, her steps slow and measured, into the anonymous darkness of the city. She didn't look like a monster. She didn't look like a queen. She just looked like a woman who had lost her way home. Clara felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a profound and aching sense of the fragility of the worlds we build for ourselves. 8 months later, the conference room was filled with the clean, promising scent of fresh blueprints and hot coffee. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the nascent foundation of the first, crimson maple assisted living community. At the head of the large oak table, Clara May Thompson, RN, stood presenting. She was no longer in a server's uniform, but in a simple, professional dress, her hair tied back. Her voice was calm and confident. To her right sat Julian Croft, listening intently. To her left sat Arthur Harrison, an honored consultant, his restored book resting on the table before him. On a large screen behind her were not spreadsheets or architectural renderings, but sketches. They were Clara's sketches, drawn from weeks spent observing in other facilities. There was a drawing of a woman's hands, gnarled with arthritis, struggling with a standard doorknob, next to a design for an elegant, easy-to-use lever handle. There was a sketch of a man in a wheelchair, his gaze fixed on the high, unreachable window in his room, beside a new blueprint with lower, wider windows. Each sketch was a story, a moment of observation that led to a tangible, compassionate design choice. This was the Harrison Protocol in action. The core principle is predictive empathy, Clara explained, pointing to a sketch of a resident looking confused in a long, featureless hallway. We don't wait for a resident to struggle. We observe, we learn their routines, their small tells, and we design the environment and the service to meet their needs before they even have to ask. It's not about just providing a room. It's about curating a life of continued grace. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before Julian Croft began to applaud, a slow, appreciative clap that was soon joined by the rest of the board. Arthur Harrison smiled, his eyes twinkling. He reached for his wife's book, its new leather binding supple under his fingers. He opened it to a page marked with a silk ribbon. "If I may," he said, his voice filling the room with its gentle authority. "Eleanor wrote something that feels appropriate for today." He began to read, his voice weaving his wife's memory into the very foundation of this new enterprise. "Do not mistake the grand gesture for the true heart," he read, "for love is not the soaring spire, but the stone set right. It is the latch that opens without a fight, the cup placed closer to the weary hand, the quiet noticing, the will to understand. It is the thread of kindness, strong and fine, that stitches days into a grand design." Clara looked from Arthur's loving face to Julian's proud one, and then at the blueprints for a future she was helping to build. She thought of that evening at the Gilded Quill, a night of endings and beginnings, of a gilded cage being broken and a new foundation being laid. Mr. Harrison was right. In the end, it was the small, quiet acts of seeing that held the most power. From here, she could see a magnificent view, one she was not just admiring, but actively creating, one empathetic sketch at a time.